Hyperactive kids.
Hyperactive kids, negative behavior, can't sit still. Thank you for people putting it in chat. It's probably the easiest way to go. Yep, a lot. Naughty kids. Yep, unfortunately. Sometimes it really looks, most people associate it with behavior. Not listening, constantly moving, daydreaming, forgetful. A lot of the different behaviors that come through. Distracted, busy, or impulsive. Yep. Some people might even think aggressive because they can't always control their responses to things, and so they will act inappropriately, sometimes argumentative. Yeah. My daughter, indecisive. Fantastic. All right, so lots of different ideas out there. And if you look at those responses, pretty much if most people's first reactions, lack of self-control, yeah, out of control, is behavior. And unfortunately, ADHD has been diagnosed since about 1902 as a behavioral sort of approach. We look for what's happening in behavior and then we sort of give it a label. However, the last 20 years of neuroscience, we've really come to understand what's actually happening in the brain. And it's almost as if we need to rewrite some of those diagnoses and actually come back with a better label so that people understand where this comes from. So this is a definition of ADHD. And I'm just going to give you a second to read it because I know me talking and you reading can actually load your brain, which is called cognitive, is part of cognitive load theory. So I'm going to just stop for a second and I'll give you a chance to have a read of this definition. All right. So part of the reason I wanted to do this session tonight is because more than half of the students I tutor are actually coming back with a double diagnosis of ADHD and a specific learning disorder. So I think it's really important as a society and a community that as parents and teachers, we become more aware of what it actually is, how to identify it and how to support it. Okay, so a few key points here. It's a neurodevelopmental disorder affecting children and it goes all the way through to adulthood for most people. It's defined by excessive symptoms of inattention or hyperactivity or impulsivity. And those symptoms have to start before 12 years of age. And the behaviours have to be inconsistent to the developmental level. And as we go through it, we'll talk about executive functions and how as a baby, we can't do much by ourselves, a toddler, we can't. But as we get older, we sort of start to build those functions and abilities to look after ourselves and plan and organise. But for people with ADHD, there's a big difference between their age and that ability. And also that these challenges impact negatively socially or academically. So in 2013, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual for Mental Disorders, the 5th edition came out and it actually defined ADHD in 3 different ways. So it's predominantly inattentive, predominantly hyperactive and impulsive, or combined presentation, which is a bit of both. So here is a lovely graphic from somebody on Twitter who just has used basically an alien to sort of describe the different types of ADHD. And just wanted to note that basically inattentive ADHD is what we used to call ADD, but now it's all called ADHD and it's either impulsive, combined, or inattentive. Some people say inattentive passive as well. All right, so this is the specific diagnostic criteria that would be on that manual. So you have to, again, I would normally let you read it, but I'll just quickly point out that you have to have 5 or more symptoms of inattention or 5 or more symptoms of hyperactivity persistent for more than 6 months. These other ones I've already repeated in the previous slide, but several of the symptoms must be present in more than 2 settings. So at school and at home, in sport or something like that. If the child is only having those behaviours at school, then there might be something else going on, or if it's only at home, etc. So it needs to be across more than one setting. And the symptoms have to interfere with or reduce the quality of the social academic functioning. So this is the criteria that educational psychologists, pediatricians are looking for before they would diagnose ADHD for a child. And there has to be no better explanation. So there may be anxiety happening, there may be OCD or other things happening. So they need to make sure that those aren't the disorders that could be explaining what's going on for the child. So this is a great infographic to give you a Venn diagram of some of the behavior characteristics that you'd see in inattentive ADHD across to hyperactive ADHD, and then in the middle, the overlapping area of ADHD, as you can see. And if the child has symptoms across all of that, inattentive and hyperactive, then that's called combined. So that's probably one of the more challenging diagnoses to have, because you go from daydreaming and not paying attention to having lots and lots of energy and being impulsive, and it's quite hard to find. It's a lot harder to get the right support or help or have people understand. Inattentive ADHD is often missed in a lot of children because they fly under the radar a lot more. There's no outward behavior that's actually drawing attention to that child's needs. Okay, so I'm going to show you a video from King's College in London, because I could sit here as a high school science teacher and give you a full science lesson, take you back to your high school days, but there's nothing better than an animation and somebody explaining it in a much more interesting way. So we'll watch a few minutes of this, then we can have a chat about. Just let me know in the chat if you can't hear it.
Attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, or ADHD as it's commonly known, affects about 1 in 20 young people around the world. It can have a major impact on life at home, in school, and with friends. Symptoms of inattention, impulsivity, and hyperactivity can reduce a person's ability to control their actions and concentrate without getting distracted. Some people have expressed skepticism about the disorder, but brain imaging has shown that symptoms of ADHD are associated with a series of abnormalities in the development and function of parts of the brain. Let's look first at the cortex, the brain's surface layer. In normal development, the cortex, which plays key roles in memory, attention, thought, and language, gradually increases in thickness before reaching a peak during teenage years. Scans have shown that in children with ADHD, the cortex generally develops more slowly, particularly in frontal and temporal lobe regions, which are important for memory and controlling behavior. Typically, the frontal cortex, along with other major parts of the brain, are smaller in children with ADHD than in those without. These different parts of the brain do not operate in isolation, but interact extensively to form networks controlling functions such as language, attention, and movement. The activity of different networks increases and decreases to allow different functions to take place. For example, while you are watching this video, activity in networks involved in processing information will have typically increased, while activity in networks involved in mind wandering will have typically decreased. In a person with ADHD, the activity of these networks is impaired, and connections within the networks are disrupted. And when we look more closely at the communication between these networks, there is also disruption in the release of the chemicals dopamine and noradrenaline, which are responsible for relaying messages between brain cells. Overall, when children with ADHD carry out particular tasks, some networks are not switched on enough, while others remain switched on too much. Research from around the world has shown widespread differences in the development and function of the brain in children with ADHD. While we can't yet use brain imaging to diagnose the disorder, the more we can learn about ADHD in the brain, the better we can understand the symptoms that children with ADHD experience in everyday life, and the more we'll be able to do to support them.
Okay, so I thought that was a really great way to explain what's happening in the brain. So some key takeaways from that was that from the brain imaging they've done in the last 20 years with people with ADHD, both children and teenagers and adults, they can see that the cortex develops more slowly, particularly the frontal and the temporal regions, which are important for memory and controlling behavior. Okay, so they sort of remain underdeveloped compared to neurotypical people. And the neurotransmitters, dopamine and noradrenaline, are disrupted, which means that, sorry, I'll just let somebody else in. Which means that it's not that they're not there or they're not, or there's too much or too little. Sorry, it doesn't mean that it's not there. It means that there's either too much or too little, and the balance of it in the system is not working like a neurotypical person, which can cause all sorts of different symptoms for different people. And for those who aren't familiar, dopamine plays a role with the reward center in our brain. So our ability to desire to do things because of the reward we get for it and the pleasure we get out of doing things. And noradrenaline is part of the flight or fight response that we have in situations. It's also a hormone in our blood as well as a neurotransmitter. So I suppose part of what we can take away from this is, whilst it's called attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, it's not really a deficit in attention. It's that the allocation of attention changes, and it can be really strong on something that we're interested in and we get a lot of reward out of, but when it's something we don't really want to do or we can't focus on it, then our attention doesn't stay there. So it's probably, deficit's probably not really the best word for it.